Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Denise is a joyful ball of energy and talent. She speaks at conferences, writes books, and is an all-around great person. I love her view on things and her balanced approach, but she does lean towards a high-carb diet side. But here's the thing. She advocates eating a lot of nutrient-dense animal products, no sugar, grains, or vegetable oils. So a lot to agree with there. I want everyone to hear this to see an opposite approach and see if it might work for you. The unifying theory of nutrition says things can work on both sides, so here's the other one. I still think it's insane to expect people to live like a tribesman in the Bolivian wilderness. You're asking all of America to eat an ultra-clean vegan diet plus organ meats. To maybe 99% of the population, that sounds awful, like the worst ever. I didn't agree on everything, but I went along with it. In retrospect, I could have challenged her more, and I also want to see some studies that actually show this dietary approach works in a scientific setting. I could have brought up more of the points supporting the low-carb diet, showing much better results in clinical trials and on lowering risk factors for heart disease, etc. But I didn't want to argue, and we already yammered on for almost 90 minutes. So support the Food Lies film on Indiegogo, and let's hear what Denise is all about. All right, Denise, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Happy to be here.
All right, I'm so excited. I recently read your book. You're such a good writer. Your intro, your first chapter, I was laughing. It was so good.
Thank you. Yeah, it's all downhill from there.
Just information. No, it was great. It was awesome. So yeah, you speak at conferences, you write. You're probably well known for your teardowns or kind of examinations of things like the China study or like vegan books or vegan propaganda film, Forks Over Knives.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. And It's really cool. You have these long breakdowns, but paradoxically, you're also pretty vegan friendly. So you you have both sides.
I'm a professional contrarian. That's my job.
Good. Well, that's why I wanted to talk to you, because you're going to kind of give us the balanced look at things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you do best. So yeah, we agree on a lot of things. We probably differ on a little bit, which we can get into at the end or later. But yeah, let's get some context about you personally. So like, what's your story behind this? And
Sure. So my whole introduction into the food world started when I was pretty young. I was 7 years old. Many people who've heard my podcast already know this story, but I almost choked on a piece of steak and I got like really meat phobic after that. Just anything with the meat texture I couldn't eat. And so I ended up neurotically going vegan or vegetarian at the age of 7 and just stuck with it. And over the years, it became more of an identity. I got more into the feeling that I was saving animals. I was always a big animal lover, so it was just like a very compatible thing for my personality. Then when I was about 10 or 11, I got extremely sick for a year with something that seemed like a flu that wouldn't go away. It was like upper respiratory stuff, fatigue. I was losing tons of weight. My hair was falling out. I looked terrible. And I went from doctor to doctor trying to figure out what was wrong. Like my parents would just shuttle me from one specialist to another, and they all had a different idea of what was wrong. They put me on Claritin, they put me on antibiotics. I actually had a surgery. I had my adenoids removed just in case that was the problem, and it turned out to be completely an unnecessary surgery. And so finally, after about a year of this, my mom took me to somebody in Seattle who was a combination medical doctor and naturopath. And I swear she didn't even touch me or anything. She just looked at me and she saw the circles under my eyes. She saw the quality of my hair and my skin. And she said, "You have a food allergy." And all these other doctors I'd been to, not a single one of them thought that my health problems at the time were related to what I was eating. Every single one thought it was some type of body part that needed to be removed or some kind of pill that needed to be given.
Why would it be diet?
Right. It's like, oh, no one even, they give you like the allergy test, but they're just the skin prick test. They're not going to analyze what you're eating. So I remember very vividly on the way to this doctor appointment, I'd been eating a bunch of goldfish crackers because I loved crackers and pasta and everything that was wheat. And the first thing she told me to do is cut out wheat from my diet, put me on an elimination diet that was going to be just like rice and vegetables for a couple weeks. Then you add back dairy, then you add back wheat, one thing at a time. And so as we were leaving this appointment, my mom took those goldfish crackers away. And I was like crying. I was like, I want my crackers back. And as luck would have it, wheat ended up being my allergy trigger at the time. It was the thing that was making me very sick. And I went a few weeks without it, became all better. And then at a birthday party as a test, ate some pizza and woke up the next day feeling like I had gotten hit by a bus. And so again, I was like 11 years old. Most kids at that age, you're not thinking about what you're eating. You're thinking about like, oh, that tastes good. I want that because it was on a commercial and that was cool. So at a very young age, I got exposed to this whole world of the things you eat actually affect your health. And not even just in a chronic disease, long-term sense. They can affect your health in a very acute, short-term period of time. So that was my beginning of like this adventure into the food world. And it was, of course, very personal for me. I doubt I ever would have gotten on this path if I didn't have my own history there. So I went wheat-free. Age of 11, had to start looking at ingredients labels, brought like really weird rice bread to school. It was embarrassing. I have like trauma from my experiences there. But that alone was not enough to make me really, really healthy. I was still getting sick a lot. I would catch colds all the time. At this time, I was still a vegetarian, and the rest of my diet wasn't like, whole foods or anything. It was a lot of fake vegetarian products and, gluten-free replacement things. And so by the time I was about 15, I online came across this forum on the website vegsource.com. And it was a forum dedicated to something called the raw vegan diet. And it was a very specific form of raw veganism. It was called 80-10-10, promoted by a guy named Doug Graham, who's a chiropractor who lives in Florida. And I was reading through this forum, like, hearing these arguments about, well, humans are the only animal that cook their food. Our physiology is so similar to other primates, yet we're eating all these foods that monkeys don't eat. And if you look at our closest genetic relatives, they're usually frugivores, things like chimps and bonobos who eat tons of fruit, tons of vegetation, maybe some insects, but they're not like these omnivorous, grain-eating, whatever creatures. And at the time, I had no background in human anatomy or like anthropology or anything that would help me actually be a critical thinker on these topics. And so again, I was 15, I was still getting sick a lot. I had to like drop out of track and field that I was enrolled in because I couldn't have the endurance or the breathing capacity to engage in the sports that I was trying to engage in. It's like all these problems I was having at such a young age. And so this all made sense to me. Like when I was reading these arguments about how people should be raw vegan because of all these various reasons that sounded convincing, it really sold me. So practically overnight, I went from whatever my diet was at the time to raw veganism, and specifically to like a fruitarian form of raw veganism. I was eating just like buckets and buckets of fruit, entire heads of lettuce, very low fat. Like it was a low fat kind of diet. It was about 80% carbohydrate by energy. And I did this for a year. And after the first few months, like I felt incredible. I'll be honest, like I was just over the moon. It was in the honeymoon period. Anytime you switch from a diet that's lower quality to something higher quality, you tend to have a really positive effect initially, just because of that movement towards betterness. But of course, the diet is incredibly limited in terms of certain nutrients, in terms of protein. It's very hard to get enough calories, especially if you're a growing teenager like I was. So after the first few months, I started having like this massive decline and the introduction of new problems, kind of similar to when I was allergic to wheat, but was still eating it. My hair started falling out. I lost so much weight. I could not keep weight on my body. My teeth were the big giveaway. I ended up with 16, I believe it was 16. I think the dentist stopped counting at some point. My teeth were just terrible. Wow. 16 cavities after 1 year on this diet, after a lifetime of basically perfect dental health. I was very meticulous about my teeth. And I think that was the trigger for me to like really wake up out of this dreamland, because I loved my teeth. Like I wanted to have good teeth. That was my thing. I was, a tooth person. So anyway, I went to the dentist. I was at the age of 17 at this point. And just like, it was the most horrifying experience of my life. Just like, I was so used to going to the dentist and getting praised. And so like I had this like this complex about it. I was like, oh, I'm going to go get my eco stroke today. So I went to the dentist, and it was just like this weird silence as he was poking my bicuspids. I heard this like, oh no. It was horrifying. I was just trembling in my seat. And yeah, basically my teeth were falling apart. the dentist was baffled. He'd never seen teeth like that on somebody so young who wasn't a smoker, who didn't have other health conditions. And that was what launched my next nutritional journey component, which was into different forms of omnivorism that were going to be health supportive. And my first foray was into stuff like the Weston A. Price Foundation. At the age of 17, I found this Yahoo message board where a lot of people who are now very prominent in the field, like Chris Masterjohn, were posting many years ago. This is 13 years ago. They were posting here and talking about things like fat-soluble vitamins, things about vitamin K2, which was this nutrient I'd never heard of. And after some time of engaging in this observation of these other communities that were not vegan, I left veganism. And for me, the health improvements that came from adding things at the time, I was eating a fermented goat dairy product that was really high in vitamin K2 and vitamin A. And that was the thing that started healing my teeth. And, to have come from a community that was heavily brainwashed against animal products and then seeing the therapeutic benefit that they can have on your body when it's in an unhealthy state, that was so eye-opening to me. And it made me realize how little I knew. It made me realize how little I could trust on the internet from people who seem really confident, because confidence is not always correlated with intelligence or competence, as you learn over time. So that brought me into the non-vegan health conscious community, which is populated by paleo, by, again, the Weston A. Price people, by real fooders. There's a big community there. And then my whole introduction into this field professionally came when I critiqued a book called The China Study. And this was a book I'd read a while back, and I read it during a time where I was not yet removed from the vegan mentality, so I didn't read it that critically. But as I had entered this omnivorous phase of my life, I spent some time on message boards trying to help vegans who are struggling with the same health problems I was struggling with. And one of the things that was always thrown in my face was, what about the China Study? It's this giant book conducted by a guy who has 18,000 credentials named T. Colin Campbell. Professor Emeritus at Cornell, so much more qualified than I am in a traditional sense to think, to breathe, to be a human. So I felt kind of intimidated by this book, but it rubbed me such a wrong way to see this book promoting a scientific case for veganism that went so contrary to my personal experience. So around this time, I had gotten hit by a car. I ended up with a large sum of pain and suffering money, which I didn't know happens when you get hit by vehicles, but apparently it's a thing. So I had the luxury of taking a lot of time off of work and just doing whatever I wanted. I wanted to move to Thailand. That did not work out. I could not get my passport. It kept getting rejected. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to stay in the United States and do something. And because I'm a big, giant nerd, I decided to go to the raw data of the China Study, which is the book itself is based on a study conducted in China in the 80s. Observational study looking at different dietary variables, lifestyle variables, and outcomes of diseases. And I was just so turned off by the way that the book of that name had presented the data that I wanted to go in there and see what the data actually said myself, just for the sake of my own knowledge. So I did that, and I spent a few months going over pages and pages of correlations of numbers, crunching my own numbers, running some statistical models based on that data. And what I found was that contrary to what the author of this book was arguing, and he was arguing that animal products are associated with basically every modern disease, I found that the study did not prove that at all. And incidentally, one of the biggest variables associated with heart disease, stroke, and other vascular diseases was wheat consumption. And that was left out of the book. So I was like, this is not showing anything bad about animal products. It's showing something really weird about wheat. This is just weird to me. And so at the time I had started a really small blog. I'm telling you, there's 5 readers. It was just minuscule. And I did not expect anything to come of this. It was just my platform, my one space on the internet where nobody could ban me from being, not a vegan. Yeah. So I had created this blog for that purpose, and I put my critique on there. And I emailed it to a few people who I'd seen online who had also contested the China Study stuff. Just, kind of was like, hey, you might be interested in this critique I wrote. And instead of it just sitting there, it went freaking viral. I had 20,000 views overnight. woke up the next day, looked at my WordPress counter, thought it was broken because I had so
Wow.
many views all of a sudden. And then I was getting emails and people were engaging me. I was getting like invited to be on podcasts. And I was like 23 and, it's like an English major. I didn't know what was going on. But I realized at that point how powerful knowledge is and how powerful it is to debate things that are untrue, to bring questioning into this fold of the nutrition communities, no matter what they are. All of them tend to be really dogmatic, and they all deserve at some point to be questioned and critiqued. It's like just a thing that needs to happen. And I found myself so exhilarated by that experience that I was like, well, if I have an audience now, I'm just going to keep doing this. And I'm just going to keep searching for the truth, basically. And whatever I find, I'm going to post online. I'm going to talk about it. No matter if it disagrees with what I believe, with what other people believe. It's just like this important quest to iron out the truth about things. Because as I experienced, and as most people in their life will experience, nutrition, health, those things are pretty fundamental to our well-being. And if you don't have the right information, that can really, really harm you. So here we are today. I am continuing to debate basically anything that feels like it's a little bit too confident and it's a little too unquestioned. I like to go and turn my focus onto those things and make sure that we're not missing something. And that applies just as much to the paleo, low carb, whatever communities as it does to the vegan community. I'm like an equal opportunity debater. So that's where I am now.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
That's good recap and got us up to speed. That's perfect. So I have a quote here from your book that kind of relates to all this and sums it up nicely. So, we leave the classroom woefully unequipped with the thinking skills that matter most: how to balance open-mindedness with skepticism, how to identify bias, and how to challenge assumptions, including our own, in a way that's truly objective. So yeah, I really like that. And I had that same theory forever. So many people go through school and you just learn a bunch of facts. Or what's the difference between someone who's smart and someone who's not that smart? Or, oh, this person went to a better school than this person, but what's the real difference? They both learned a bunch of facts. And the real difference is critical thinking skills and all that kind of stuff that you talked about. So I love that. And
exactly.
I think that's sort of the theme of this podcast, hopefully, is doing that and being open-minded. So we can talk about your book for a second. You go through the story. Well, it's called Death by Food Pyramid. So there's a story of how we came up with these dietary guidelines. What are some highlights from that story? There's the Ansel Keys stuff a lot of people talk about. Talk about that, I guess. Start with Ansel Keys. 6 countries, 7 countries.
Okay, Ansel Keys, this is a great one to begin with, just because I want to start out by saying I'm not actually anti-Ansel Keys. In fact, over the years, as I've looked at his stuff more in depth, I think he's presented as a villain unfairly for a lot of reasons. And I won't go into all of those because I have like blog posts on it too for anyone who's interested. But basically, his whole thing started with the use of epidemiology, which is studying populations, looking for trends. It's not controlling variables. It's just observing patterns that occur. So you can't really determine cause and effect. And many years ago, back in the 50s, he was compiling data that he noticed where on a national level, the intake of fat seemed to correlate with that nation's rate of heart disease. And there's a graph that he created that is all over the internet. It's like this beautiful curve of 6 different countries that's lined up based on national fat intake and national heart disease rates. And it makes it look like the more fat you eat, the higher your risk of heart disease, basically, at least on a national level. And it's really important to note that this graph, even though it's super popular right now, when he first released that, he was basically laughed out of the conference where he presented it. Like, nobody believed him. It was not a very compelling piece of evidence at the time. Like, back in the 50s, for so many decades, people did not even really believe that nutrition was affecting chronic disease. Like, this was a huge conspiracy theory for a while. It was not believed thoroughly. Like, we need to make sure we understand that if we're looking back at these historical periods of time, the mentality there was so different than it is right now. So we can't look at how we're thinking now and assume people were on that same page back then, because they weren't. So Ansel Keys was actually one of the first people to bring this idea to the public that things like fat intake might be influencing heart disease risk. So when he first emerged onto the field, back in the 1950s, he presented this idea. He was laughed out of his conference, went home with his tail between his legs, and kind of recommitted to like, oh, if they laughed at me there, I'm going to recommit my focus and make something that they can't laugh at. And so the result of that was something called the 7-country study, which was 7 different countries, obviously based on the name, were selected, and their dietary intake of different things were studied and compiled over many years. And from that, more correlations were drawn between dietary variables and heart disease outcome. And the 7-country study is an early piece of epidemiology that's very interesting because of its kind of it was like a forerunner for all these things that came later. But the problem with the study was that some of the conclusions were misrepresented and some of the conclusions were used later to like reinforce public policies about fat intake. So Ansel Keys gets blamed a lot for kind of starting a low fat thing because he found certain links between fat intake and heart disease. But it's important to remember again that like he was just kind of the beginning of that. He wasn't, I want to be really careful about not creating a villain persona for him. But what's interesting is after that, he kind of took over the American Heart Association a lot. He got his claws into a lot of different things that leaked into public policy. And it sort of started America on this cruise towards having low-fat diets being the ideal. And so he's often considered the grandfather of the low-fat movement for that reason. But what's also interesting is while he was doing his work, another researcher named Judkins was kind of doing the same thing, but looking at sugar. And so if you look at the historical battle between these two figures, it's like we had one person who was trying to prove that sugar was causing heart disease and all these other chronic illnesses. And then you had Ansel Keys, who was trying to say the same thing about fat. And Ansel Keys was the one who won. Like he dominated eventually for various reasons. But, back in history, there were many different theories that were emerging, and it was kind of just luck of the draw in some ways, which ones ended up dominating.
So then after Keys and Yudkin, there was a committee put together to decide what our dietary guidelines would be. Talk about that.
So this was something headed by George McGovern, who was a senator at the time, and he was feeling kind of salty over his loss of his presidential campaign. And so he was, after losing very, very depressingly the presidency, he transferred some of that energy into building this committee on basically like health. And it started out a little different than what it morphed into. But ultimately, it became basically like a platform for creating new public policy about human dietary guidelines. And, the U.S. had different dietary guidelines that were released historically, like during World War II, you had like different manifestations of these guidelines over the years, but none of them were targeted at tackling chronic disease. And the 1970s were unique because we were seeing this explosion of healthcare costs associated with things like cancer and diabetes and heart disease and all these issues that hadn't really been in the forefront of like human health concerns historically. Because if you look back in time, the early 1900s up through maybe the 1940s, our main diseases were ones of malnutrition and starvation and deficiency. And so it wasn't until our food supply started changing a bit that we started seeing more heart disease and these chronic diseases opposed to diseases of deficiency. So the U.S. was in kind of a strange position because it needed to do something to put a cap on these healthcare costs. It wasn't completely altruistic, like, oh, we just need to help people live longer. It was more like, no, we need to reduce costs of like the burden of their disease. So McGovern was in charge of this committee that compiled expert opinions. It took feedback from the public. It took feedback from food industries. It tried to make sense of everything we knew at the time about nutrition. And he released the first manifestation of like our guidelines stating that we should be eating a low-fat, higher carbohydrate diet. And he had distilled that information, him and his committee had distilled that information based on all of this feedback they'd gotten. And that was kind of the happy medium that they settled on, which of course in the time since then has been hotly contested. But that was his role. Yeah.
Okay. Wait, was there vegetarian influence on that?
There was a little bit in the sense that Nick Mautern, who was basically a graduate student, I think he was from Columbia, who was in charge of actually writing out the guidelines. He was a vegetarian. He was very heavily influenced by animal rights, by wanting to have a really green planet. Like he that was his goal. And it's hard to say in retrospect how much that opinion of his influenced the actual guidelines. But there was a little bit of like this anti-meat thing that was going on that did result in the creation of a meat reduction recommendation.
Yeah. The history of meat demonization started with Seventh-day Adventists and Ellen G. White. And yeah, I've heard other people talk about it, and it fascinates me that I was like, why do people think meat is bad? For all of history, meat has been a pillar of nutrition. It's like, this is what we want. It's still, most societies strive for meat, in like rural, say lesser developed countries. It's like, yes, we get to eat meat. This is our, we can afford it this week and it's prized. So I don't understand why we think it's so bad. And it seems to have started for this religious reason, and like even visions of this girl who thought meat made men angry and violent and all this weird stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So that's always interesting. So there is, I won't say that the Seventh-day Adventism stuff really reflected on the public's opinion at large of meat, but that was something that contributed to certain vegetarian branches that ended up growing quite a bit. And yeah, there was a belief within, Adventism and some other kind of more fringe belief systems that meat was kind of carnal, like it would just ignite the passions, and it would, that had this connotation of being really savage and not of God. So there was definitely that component that influenced some people's decision to not consume meat. But I think more broadly, something that you mentioned that's good to look at is this idea that meat has been so prized and not necessarily easy to obtain all the time within historical periods. It's always been something that is incredibly energy dense and therefore valuable to human societies. And part of the reason that meat started to be demonized is because in societies that were able to procure like a steady supply of meat, like societies that became westernized, those same societies were seeing a rise in chronic health conditions at the same time as their food supply was changing. And it's easy to look at, again, draw correlations where cause and effect might not be actually in play. Because when you look at what happens with westernization, you see not only an increase in meat consumption, you also see an increase of refined grain consumption and sugar consumption and sedentary lifestyles, because we're introducing tech that, we're outsourcing the functions of our body to technology. TV viewership goes up. If you look at all the trends going on at the same time, you can see that meat consumption was kind of correlated with rises of chronic disease. At the same time, all these other things were happening. So again, from like an observational standpoint, you can look back on that and say, oh, it looks like meat is kind of driving these trends, but there's absolutely no way to really say that. However, because many of our early studies were only observational and we did not have the clinical trials looking at mechanisms, and we did not have a clear understanding of how different foods and lifestyle variables were on a very specific level affecting our health, we kind of had to rely on these observations to start drawing hypotheses. And so part of meat's problem is that it got caught up in a lot of different changes that were affecting Western societies, and it came out to look like a villain. So it's not just that we were making things up. There have been patterns that we've seen with meat consumption. We just were a little overeager in ascribing cause and effect to those things.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And a lot of people agree, and you probably will agree, it's also what you're eating with the meat. I mean, you kind of did mention that, but I mean, you're looking at even modern observational studies. They're saying, oh, well, people who eat meat have a higher chance of heart disease or death or this and that. I'm like, the biggest consumption of meat is, say, a hamburger meat, and we're eating with a bun and fries and a soda. And it's very obvious that you're not just eating meat by itself, and there's so many confounding variables. I mean, that seems to be the biggest problem with all of this is Yudkin wasn't right, Keyes wasn't right. It's not sugar or fat. It's a combination of the two.
Right. It's the combination of the two. It's the absence of whole plant foods too. Like, one fascinating thing you'll see if you look at meat studies is when you find a positive relationship between meat consumption and, say, cancer, heart disease, that relationship usually goes away or becomes very, very small once you adjust for vegetable consumption. And because, people who are very heavy meat eaters, if you take away all the paleo people, like the weirdos who are like omnivores but really care about their health, if you take them away, in the general public, you're going to see an inverse relationship between meat consumption and like whole plant foods, fruits and vegetables, whatever. So in studies, it's really hard to pin the cause and effect on meat consumption versus the absence of something beneficial or, whatever. It's so complicated, and it can't be completely fixed retroactively with statistics, even though that's what researchers try to do. It's just, it doesn't work.
Yeah, they try to. And there's so many other things other than just the vegetable part. There's lifestyle choices, less smoking. Right. If you're vegetarian or vegan, you tend to have a ton of other lifestyle choices that are healthier. Yeah.
If you look at studies that look at lifestyle variables, like you just mentioned, and they're grouped in categories based on like your vegetarian, vegan, or omnivore status, there is, every time I've seen this kind of study done, it's always the same. You see that the vegans, vegetarians, they drink less alcohol. They are far less likely to be smokers. They're more likely to be exercising. They have a higher vegetable intake. They eat fewer donuts. Like, there's just very specific things that are patterns that repeat throughout every time the study is conducted. And I think it does show a really clear picture that health consciousness tends to be grouped with your level of vegetarianism. It's just like on a social level, it happens that way.
Yeah, and I wish there was studies. So paleo people or low carb or whatever you want to call them, they're not an official group, and maybe they will be soon. But if they were a more official group like the vegetarians, then maybe people could study them in that they are meat eaters and care about their health and are eating whole foods and vegetables and make these better choices for their lifestyle.
Exactly. The one study I would pay out of my own pocket, like to see it be manifested, is a study of like whole food, plant-based, vegetarian style people against whole food, mixed animal plant diet paleo people, and like have as many other variables be equalized as possible in terms of lifestyle, smoking, drinking, whatever, but have that one thing, like the presence of meat in the context of a really otherwise healthy diet, measure that, like follow those people and see if their health outcomes are really that different, because that would answer so many of our questions, because we don't have that kind of study. We have a lot of studies on whole food, plant-based dieters. We have some clinical trials that are actually pretty awesome, and there's more of them coming along every day on the paleo people, but we don't have, and again, as you said, there's not enough paleo people right now who've been doing it for a while to be able to round them all up, do a population study on them. Because again, in paleo itself, it's like, what paleo are you talking about? There's like 20,000 versions of it. So it's difficult.
Well, it's impossible. Difficult. Here, my harebrained scheme is to, on organ donor sticker on your license, you have a certified low carb sticker or a certified plant-based sticker. And then you check it at the morgue and you see.
That's actually not a bad idea.
Yeah, well, if you could verify that someone actually follows that is the hard part. I mean, it's not impossible, except for, well, this guy pretended he was, but he wasn't. But, all right, we'll see. I'll work on that someday.
Do it. I'd vote for it.
Okay, speaking of studies too, like vegetarians and vegans love to trot out studies like, we live longer, this and that, like all this stuff we're talking about, even though they could be biased or there's different factors. Also, it seems like the researchers are a lot of times biased. But besides that, studies can kind of show anything. Like you mentioned a few studies that show that vegetarians have a higher risk of mortality, right?
Yeah, it really depends on which population you're looking at. Because when you move, I think the one you're talking about was that in Taiwan? I believe it was.
There's a German one too. I don't know.
There's a German one. Yeah, so it's the German one, if I recall, it was looking at actually kind of, as we just mentioned, like a group of health conscious people who were health food store shoppers, and like they were recruited from that environment, so they were all kind of on that same wagon of health consciousness. And so when you take away those lifestyle differences and you start to homogenize the lifestyle factors a little bit more, you do not see that major difference in terms of like mortality and disease rates and all of that between vegetarians, vegans, and omnivores. It becomes much more equalized. And I would have to look at that specific study again to remember what it said, but there have been studies showing that when the playing field is leveled a bit, certain diseases might actually be higher among vegetarians. And then there was one I recall in Taiwan too that showed a higher risk, I believe, of heart disease among Taiwanese vegetarians compared to omnivores. And there can be a lot of different reasons for that. It could be because, you're eating a lot of like vegetable oil fried foods. It could be that you're low in vitamin B12, your homocysteine is high, you're getting heart disease as a result of certain things in that vein. But yeah, we should definitely like squash that myth that all studies show that vegetarians live longer. There's even one, I think, among the Seventh-day Adventists recently showing that it was the fish eaters among all of the Adventists who were, vegetarian, vegan, pescatarian, or omnivore. You're not supposed to be an omnivore, but there are Adventists who cheat.
Yeah.
It was actually the fish eaters who were living the longest and had the best disease outcomes. So that was, I remember that one too.
Well, there's also the Mormons that live similar lifestyles. I mean, the Seventh-day Adventists, don't drink alcohol. Right. They have all these good factors that make them live a little bit longer. But the Mormons have no meat eating restrictions, and they still live just as long as the Seventh-day Adventists. So
yeah, I think it's pretty equivalent. Yeah. And then with both of those communities too, you factor in community itself, like the social aspect of having a group you belong to, of having a pretty tight-knit community dynamic that, apart from diet and lifestyle and other senses, can actually go a really long way to enhance longevity.
Definitely. And I was surprised to see the Seventh-day Adventists promote a lot of the other good stuff, the lifestyle factors, like getting a lot of sun and close-knit family and exercise. Like they kind of had it on point.
They did. I mean, it's pretty easy to see why they would live longer. A lot of beautiful features within that lifestyle.
Yeah. All right. So you mentioned vegetable oils too. So a lot of people think that vegetable oils are awesome for you because they're made from vegetables. And why would it not be awesome? But they're a whole different kind of compound, really, especially at high heats. And it seems like we should replace them instead of animal fats that are supposedly bad for us. But for one thing, it's not true. And you can talk about a little bit about the chemical difference. But also, I always say, why would these industrial seed oils and canola oil, corn oil, or other vegetable oils be what's good for us when we just invented them 50 years ago? This is it doesn't make any sense. Like, humans have been around forever. What kind of cruel joke would it be if, we finally figured it out in 1950? Like, this is how you're supposed to eat.
That sums it up right there. So much of what we believe about different fats is based on their effect on blood cholesterol levels. And so as we've had a really cholesterol-centric focus just for battling heart disease and, looking at human health in general, experiments that have been done using vegetable oils versus saturated animal fats have shown that vegetable oils tend to reduce blood cholesterol levels compared to, a higher saturated fat intake. And so that one piece alone has kind of made vegetable oils the darlings of the nutrition world, especially like just, mainstream nutrition, what's promoted by the USDA and so forth. Of course, you then have to actually look at what does a high vegetable oil intake do on a more holistic level to the human body? Is it actually improving our health? Is it actually reducing heart disease rates? Can we make sure it's not actually increasing our risk of something else? And one of the concerns with vegetable oils is the potential to actually increase cancer risk, because the fat content of our diet ends up being reflected in the composition of our cells, our cell membranes, which have a lipid layer. And polyunsaturated fats, just because they have so many double bonds, they're more susceptible to damage and attack. They can oxidize. Like if you leave a bottle of vegetable oil on the counter versus a bottle of coconut oil, the coconut oil is going to stay fine for a long time, but the vegetable oil will go rancid. And that's due to the oxidation capacity of that specific type of unsaturated fat. So when we put a bunch of that in our bodies, it's not the best idea. And even if you remove the effect on human health, if we look at it from an economic standpoint, we can see why it's being so heavily pushed, because vegetable oils are very, very cheap to produce. They're a big part of our agricultural economy at this point, especially corn oil and soybean oil. There's an incentive to keep producing them and to keep having humans eat them that's maybe not quite there in the same way with animal fats. So there's a lot of moving parts there. And I think especially in the upcoming years, we're going to start seeing, even like in mainstream nutrition, kind of a retraction of this advice to pour soybean oil on everything and use corn oil in lieu of natural animal fats and stuff. And I think we're going to see kind of a more balanced perspective coming out, because the evidence to consume high amounts of vegetable oils is really not there in the science. It's kind of frightening.
You're being really level-headed about it, but there's I've seen a lot of studies that show that it actually is bad, especially at high temperatures when you're deep frying stuff in it.
Absolutely. If you're looking at, cooking methods and stuff, you definitely don't want to be frying your food in anything that's susceptible to oxidizing, because you're going to be ingesting a bunch of oxidized oils, and that's one of the worst things you can put in your body.
Yeah, we used to use beef tallow to fry fries, and then vegetarian interest group changed that, and now everyone's using these vegetable oils, so they're doing more harm. How crazy is that? They're probably screwing us over more with their stupid ideas. Well, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about metabolic flexibility. This is really cool. When I talked to you the first time, I didn't see the whole side of things. Like I keep trying to look at all sides and watch vegan videos and see what they're up to. And wait, why does their stuff work sometimes? Like why? Or you hear about the Simone, if that's how you pronounce it, in Bolivia. And, they're eating a ton of starches in their diet and very low fat, and they have very low heart disease, and they have clean arteries, and, they're in the news, and everyone loves to say, oh, this is why we're supposed to be vegetarian. Look how awesome these people are. But for one, there's tons of different variables, and they're eating unprocessed foods. But also, there is a way, there's a different metabolic state that our bodies can go into. And this was so interesting to me. And you did a presentation on what we learned from the vegans, and it snapped into focus. If I could paraphrase, it was, if you have 10% less of fat, kind of like the 80-10-10 you were talking about, like these raw vegans, you can actually tolerate carbs well. And you go into a different metabolic state that allows you to not have like huge insulin spikes and all the problems associated with eating carb and starches. And then there's a different kind of magic, as you called it, that happens when you go high fat. So if you go around 70% fat, like a ketogenic diet, then a different kind of magic happens, and your body doesn't do well with the carbs, but it does really well by burning fat, and it's very efficient and it works well. And that's why so many people love the low carb diet. So talk about that. I guess I kind of talked about it for you, but
I'll talk about it again. Oh,
yeah, there's different angles and different nuances and all kinds of stuff. So what's
absolutely. Yeah. I love talking about this because it makes my brain hurt so much. I love it. So as you described, I kind of came up with this idea of the macronutrient spectrum, which has magic on one end, the very, very low fat, high carbohydrate end, magic on the other side, which is the very, very low carbohydrate, high fat end, ketogenic, whatever you want to call it. And then in the middle, I call it the swampland, the macronutrient swampland, where you're eating roughly equivalent amounts of fats and carbohydrates. It's the typical Western diet. If you look at different Westernized nations, we all tend to end up kind of in this middle zone. Like even in America, I need to point this out, especially because of the nature of the book I wrote. Some people read the title and misinterpret what it's about. America is not a low-fat nation. We have never been a low-fat nation. The average fat intake, even like during low-fat periods, was still over 30% of our calories is fat, which compared to true traditional low-fat societies, as well as the low-fat diets that have proven in clinical studies to reverse diabetes and heart disease and other things, that's actually a high-fat intake. And so even when we had like the food pyramid come out, tell us to eat less fat, the average American fat intake did not actually go down that much. So it's important to note that like we are not a low fat experiment. We're a swampland experiment. And that's why our health is so crappy.
Yeah, exactly.
So like, I mean, really, you can look at like the African Bantu, the Kitavans, traditional Taiwanese, Okinawans. That one's a little shaky because we're not quite sure. There's some controversy about how they actually eat. But there's like a Papua New Guinea, like the Pina Indians. There's so many different groups where we've analyzed their diet, and it's below 15% fat, sometimes below 10% fat on average. And these are groups that have maintained robust health, especially in terms of avoiding the chronic diseases that we see in Western countries. So for me, like when I've looked at those populations, before the wheels started turning in my head and this idea of the swampland and whatever came about, that really bothered me because it went so contrary to the things that we're often told about fat and carbohydrate intake. We're told that low-fat diets cause the diabetes epidemic. We're told that low-fat diets contribute to heart disease. We're told a lot of things that don't match up with this reality when we look at traditional populations that are actually really eating a low-fat diet. So this is like observing these things. That's what got my thoughts kind of on this topic, on this area, created this hypothesis about the swampland. So yeah, there's magic on both ends. And so my focus in the past few years has been looking more on the low-fat end, because I think we have a lot of great minds looking at the ketogenic stuff. That has its own therapeutic value that I don't even know the full extent of. I'm just not as interested in it because I like carbs. I like fruit.
Okay,
I like carbs.
There's a ton of good stuff on the keto side. Well, that's for another podcast. I'll talk to Dom D'Agostino about that or something.
Exactly. I mean, there's plenty to say on that too. So I like to balance things out. So, there's so much stuff going on over there. I'm like, well, what about this little neglected end over here? So the question is, why does it work? That has been what I've been exploring and trying to figure out. And I think we have actually a lot of mechanisms that we can identify for why a very low-fat diet might be really therapeutic for people. One of them has to do with something called the Randle cycle, which is basically the competition between free fatty acids and glucose in the blood for use as fuel by the cells. And what's fascinating is that free fatty acids, when there's a high concentration in the blood, they actually block the use of glucose by cells. So there's like this rivalry between these two fuel sources. And obviously the body can use both, but it wants to use one more than the other at any given moment. So there's something to the idea that, for example, when you eat a meal that's mixed carbohydrates and fat, the presence of carbohydrates, in theory, when we're healthy, shuts off the release of fatty acids from our fat tissue, kind of suctions them back out of the bloodstream so that our blood content of the fat is lower. And it does that so that we can better use the carbohydrate content of whatever we just ate, like the sugar that's now in the bloodstream. But what's interesting is when you eat something that's almost pure carbohydrate with no fat, that process is very efficient. When you eat a meal that has both carbohydrates and fat, as the fat in your bloodstream is being taken up out of chylomicrons, being brought back into cells, there's something called spillover that happens, where some of those fatty acids spill back into the bloodstream and keep a certain fatty acid pool going even when there's carbohydrates. So when you have a mixture of fatty acids and glucose in the bloodstream, you're actually going to limit your body's ability to use that glucose. And that's one reason why, and I want to talk about this because this is awesome. There's a bunch of studies that are, not a bunch, there's like 3 or 4. There's some studies that are done looking at consumption of potatoes and butter and different combinations between those two things. Like that's all that's in these experiments. And what they find, so first thing, we'll just look at non-diabetic healthy people. We're kind of told frequently in the health conscious communities to add fat to high carbohydrate foods to improve the blood sugar response and improve the insulin response. Like that's pretty common wisdom. It's like, oh, add some cream to your berries, or, eat some almond butter with your banana, to blunt things. So when they've done this with potatoes, a very high carbohydrate food, studies have shown in healthy people, when you add butter to potato, it does reduce the glucose response, but it does not reduce the insulin response. And in fact, the more butter you add to a potato, the more insulin is needed to handle the equivalent amount of blood glucose that's in your bloodstream. So it essentially makes insulin less effective, even if you're blunting the blood sugar response. And where it gets really interesting is when you look at diabetics. If you give a diabetic a potato, you can measure the insulin response and the glucose response, then put some butter on that same potato, repeat the study under the same circumstances. Adding butter does not reduce the glycemic response, but it does make that diabetic patient need more insulin to handle the entire meal. So there's like this attenuating effect of fat and carbohydrate that happens in a smaller level in healthy people, but then in a pretty severe level with diabetics. In fact, if you look at guidelines for like type 1 diabetics who've been living with their condition for a while, there's a very clear trend within the scientific literature that anytime you add fat to the meal, you need to increase your insulin dose, even if the carbohydrate intake stays the same. And that's because of this interactive effect between fat and carbohydrates. And now I'll say, like, in a healthy person, if you're metabolically healthy, if you're physically active, if you're not overweight, there's probably no danger in combining fat and carbohydrates. If you're if you're in that state, it's not going to kill you. And that's why plenty of people do fine in this macronutrient swampland without getting the diseases of civilization that are plaguing us. But when you start introducing problems into the works, if you're somebody who is diabetic already, if you have heart disease already, if there's something metabolically wrong with your body, there seems to be a danger in chronically mixing fat and carbohydrates. Part of it has to do with the Randle cycle. Part of it has to do with other things too. But I think that's part of why we see such a clear benefit for people who are either reducing carbohydrates to very low levels or reducing fat to really low levels, because it's causing this partitioning of two things that don't play well together.
Yeah, I love that so much, and everything makes so much more sense in the world now. And I'm so glad you talked about it. Yay! I was talking about this with Ted Naiman too, and I thought he was like this hardcore meat guy. He's like, I'll only eat meat and low sugar fruits. But he's like, oh no, he talked all about this, and all these different things going on. And so now I wish everyone on the paleo world and the vegan world would understand this and stop fighting about it, and everything makes sense now, right? Yeah, but I think, okay, but then I do have a big problem with it still. Okay, so what I kind of have a problem with is knowing, okay, now we know that you can do well if you go on this very low fat, high carb, or you can do the opposite. And it's a war, and the vegans are saying this is the only way to do it, and the paleo is saying it's the only way to do it. But I think one way is a lot easier to sustain, that's more delicious, and that needs to be promoted, because people aren't going to do that correctly. I shouldn't speak like that. But I think it's very hard for a lot of people to eat very low fat diet, like you're saying, like 10% fat, very low fat, and try to do that for their whole life and not eat vegetable oils, not eat refined carbohydrates, not eat a lot of sugars, and just eat tubers and all these whole foods, but no fat. It seems crazy to me. Some people can do it because maybe they have these moral and views and don't want to eat animals, and that helps them stick to it. But most people, so that's what I think is a problem with the US dietary guidelines. They just said, okay, let's try to eat low fat, but no one's actually following that exactly. Yeah. So I think it goes way more wrong when you try to promote that, if you could tell people they have an option. And the better way, I think, we could talk about the smaller details of why I think it's better, but to go low carb is better because you still get to enjoy so many more foods that most people like, not all people, but most people love to eat a steak or eggs or all that kind of thing. So cheese, dairy, I think it's really hard to avoid fat so much. So tell me, maybe you can talk about what you eat later, but What do you think about that?
I think it's very subjective. I think your opinion is shared by a lot of people, and I think that's why we see probably at this point in time more people going to the low carb side of things than people going to the low fat plant-based side. But I also think that if we instilled the low carbohydrate stuff as some type of dietary national guideline, the food industry would totally hack that to make it bad for you. Like they would be like, okay, now we can eat a lot of fat. So here, let's up the vegetable oils and everything. Let's like create all these crappy high fat replacement products like we did with these crappy low fat replacement products. I mean, there's no way to introduce something into public policy without it getting taken advantage of by the food industry and turned into an atrocity. That's just how things work. That's just how things work. True. Yeah, so there's that. So I think what we need to do personally is just ignore everything the government says.
Well, but their guidelines dictate what schools, nursing homes, military, all that kind of stuff, what's served there.
It does. And that's a shame, and I have no idea how to fix that. Like even with the low fat guidelines, things would have been so much better if they had taken away, because with the low fat guidelines, those were still promoting vegetable oils. They were like swap out the animal fats for soybean oil, for corn oil, for canola oil. So it was like still this movement towards promoting products that are profitable to our agricultural foundations. So I don't think there's any way to divorce our economy from our food guidelines. Like that's just something that they're married within our nation, within different nations too. So it's like, they do everything the government says. It does affect, as you mentioned, like school lunches, hospital food, prison food, several other things too. But Yeah, actually, I truly have no solution for that, and I hope that you
Well,
dedicate your life to finding that. So,
I'm gonna figure it out.
I'm so on board with that. If you can figure it out, high fives forever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd love to figure it out. There's so much going on though with the food industry that they're gonna have to make their money no matter what. And
Exactly.
I don't think there was a conspiracy at all, but they are very opportunistic. And so, yeah, the government recommended low fat and they came up with these crazy products that are horrible for you. And they're replacing the fat with sugar and all this other junk. So,
Yeah.
there's always going to be the food industry. And I don't know. Yeah, there's absolutely no way to figure it out. But all right. What? I still have some other problems with, okay, so do you really think that they're on an equal playing field, that people, the normal person in America would and could eat this very low fat, mostly plant food diet?
I think it really depends on the specific individual. And I will say, like if we're only looking at the current dietary climate, like when you go out to a restaurant or you go out to a party, I think it is easier for people to eat higher fat foods just because it's easier to recognize a carbohydrate. Like if you're eating some vegetables, you don't know if that's covered in oil or if it's covered in some type of fat. Like it's easier to spot carbohydrates than it is to spot like hidden fats. So just from that perspective, yes, it's probably easier for people to operate in this world with a low carbohydrate diet. At least in America, you might travel elsewhere in the country and have the exact opposite experience. You might go to Southeast Asia and be like, okay, I have to eat low fat here. It's easier. But that being said, I don't think that these two ends of the spectrum are completely interchangeable in terms of their long-term health effects. And I actually at this point believe that the lower fat end long-term is probably going to create an overall healthier human being. And I know that's very controversial to say.
No, I don't believe
but I
it.
think the effects of a lower fat diet on the gut microbiome, I think the long-term effects on insulin sensitivity are going to be much better with lower fat diet. I think the benefit... Sorry, go ahead.
You're assuming that someone's following this. There's so many caveats. You can't be eating, because you can have low fat and have a terrible diet. So you
can. So I'm speaking more in terms of a whole food plant-centered diet that has specifically chosen animal products that are high in nutrient density, but that are not high fat.
So what is that? Okay, so lay that out, because your diet sounds... Yeah, no, it sounds crazy.
Not to toot my own horn, no. Yeah.
It sounds insane to me. And I don't know if people would ever do this. Like, no one does this but you. You're not...
I mean, I know I'm weird. It's
but
okay.
I'm just not endorsed. I don't know if I agree with this at all. But I agree with you so much, except for that no one's going to eat this diet. Vegans aren't going to eat it. Normal people aren't going to eat it. Paleo people aren't going to eat it. What is this?
I disagree. It's
okay. What is this ideal diet? So what is this ideal diet that you can't be eating bread? You can't. There's so many things you can't eat. Okay, just tell it to me.
So this, I would say, here's your pool of foods to select from. Every single non-starchy vegetable that's non-poisonous to the human body is an option. All types of fruit are an option. Also, all kinds of tubers are an option. Like so many different kinds of tubers, like sweet potatoes, regular white potatoes, which are an amazing source of resistant starch if you cook them correctly, if you cook them and cool them. They're amazing for the gut microbiome. You have all these weird, go to an Asian food store and look at their huge selection of root vegetables, and all of those things can be incorporated into your diet. Legumes are actually, I changed my stance on the whole legume issue, which from a paleo perspective, it's often said that these are Neolithic foods. They have too many lectins and anti-nutrients. But every study that's done on legumes show that they're beneficial. And so you can have a diet that's rich in those, especially lentils seem to work really well. You can have organ meats, which are actually usually very low in fat, contrary to popular belief, especially liver. It's mostly protein. Shellfish, you can have a lot of different kinds of seafood that are even the higher omega-3 stuff. In the context of this kind of diet, you can still eat those foods without it bumping your fat and take up too much. The biggie is to avoid using isolated oils. That's the biggest thing to knock your fat intake down, is to instead of frying things in oil, stir fry them in vegetable broth or chicken broth or something like that. There's different ways of cooking to eliminate your use of added oils. Like for me, that's been amazing because when you take away the isolated oil component of your diet, you can eat so much food and like you just, it's great. Like you don't, it just changes the way you're conceiving of your food. But I mean, it's like, it's not a limited diet in the sense of what you have to eat. Like you don't have to eat the same thing every day. The main thing is to avoid really fatty cuts of meat, to avoid dumping oil on your salads, to avoid using a lot of oil in cooking. And once you do that, and once you dramatically improve your vegetable intake, your plant food intake, it's actually not a hard diet to stick with. Like, I mean, I know you're chuckling. I know you're chuckling. I know other people eat this way, which is why I know I'm not at least the only one in the world.
All right, no, I fully accept that it's good for you and that it could be good. But I think it's hard enough for people to eat a whole foods diet. So now you're saying you do whole foods diet, but you can eat like chicken liver and you can't eat any wheats. You have to eat only potatoes and tubers. And it's hard enough to get people to do a whole foods paleo style diet where you're saying, hey, have all the bacon. You can have guacamole and cheese. That's hard enough to get people to do. I can't get anyone to do that. All my friends and family, they won't even do that. They're still, well, I'm just going to eat my pasta and, blah, blah. Like no one can do it.
Okay.
We're the extremes. Okay, we're the extremes.
Well, I think there's two separate questions here. One is what is actually optimal, and the other one is what will people actually eat? And of course, as you're saying, those two things are not necessarily one and the same. But for me, my whole goal is to find out what is optimal, because once we have that understanding, we can help tailor our advice to other people in a better way. Like, one of the benefits of the way that I've described my eating style is the type of fiber and resistant starch. Basically, there's a lot of nutrients in there that are going to wildly benefit the gut microbiome. And that doesn't mean that people who are eating higher fat diets can't also include those foods, but like the quantity it's hard to achieve if you're eating a lot of fat. It's just, it's going to change.
But you even talk about that a lot of people have a starch intolerance or a carb intolerance and that it doesn't work for everyone. And I was just listening to Rob Wolf's podcast. He's really scientific about this and really, and he's like, well, I just can't eat. He's talking to a gut microbiome expert. And he's like, yeah, I know that I eat resistant starches and I tried them and I feel horrible.
Yeah. So there's a huge genetic component. There's, I think, as you mentioned, like our gut microbiomes are kind of flexible, but there's certain things that are really hard to change as adults. They're kind of set in place when we were growing up very young, our early exposures. And I'm, as you said, I'm confident that does affect how people respond to different diets. So yeah, I mean, obviously if somebody's failing miserably with a starch-centric diet or a diet that's kind of how I'm describing, don't do it if you're obviously failing on it. Like don't do the blame the victim thing. It's, you need to modify what you're eating. But the same goes for people on higher fat diets, low carbohydrate diets. Like, as using myself as an example, the worst I've ever felt on a diet was when I was doing perfect paleo low carb. I felt miserable. It was like the worst hell I could imagine, and that's the opposite experience of a lot of other people. Yeah. But that's part of why I've ended up on this spectrum. It's where I feel good. Well, so I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, that works for you. So yeah, I mean, we got to try to be more unbiased about it.
Yeah.
That's really weird that it went that poorly for you.
It's weird, but I don't know if it's really that weird. I'm not the only one that I've encountered with that. Especially women actually seem as if you dip below a certain level of carbohydrate intake, women tend to be more susceptible to hormonal problems and thyroid problems than men do.
Yeah.
So I think that
definitely
that
heard about that
too. Yeah.
Well, not everyone needs to go like crazy keto, but yeah. So do you really think there's no inflammation in a high carb diet if you're eating all these starches?
It doesn't have to be a really high starch intake. My diet's not super high starch, but yeah, I mean, if you're eating whole food sources, I think for the average human, if you're not dealing with something specific like a certain gut microbe overgrowth that's getting fed by the higher starch intake, or there's other things that can influence it. Yeah, this type of diet is not going to be pro-inflammatory at all. Yeah.
So it's just inflammatory if you're eating both, because a lot of people anecdotally talk about, and I've noticed inflammation go down when I stopped eating carbs, and I wasn't even that many carbs before, and I still eat carbs here and there or on the weekends. I'm not but still I definitely notice a difference. And so you're just saying it's because of the combination.
I would say it's mostly because of the combination combined with certain genetics. I don't like using black and white terms with this. Like there's definitely going to be people who try eating what I eat and feel miserable. Like I'm not going to pretend that's not true. So
yeah. Okay. On your type of diet, I've seen a lot of vegans that look like they're going to fall over if a wind picks up. And is it just the lack of protein?
Mostly. I would say the biggest problem with the way plant-based, low-fat, plant-based diets are designed is completely eliminating animal products. And there's, even if you have evidence that the low-fat component is really important, there really isn't evidence that a low animal protein component has any added benefit. And so for me, I wouldn't be able to eat the way I'm currently eating without the addition of lean animal products. And I actually do eat a lot of lean animal products. I have a pretty high intake of that. So
I like that, like highly nutrient dense organ meats.
They're great. And shellfish as well, which are like the organs of the ocean. Yeah.
Clams, mussels. You're eating the whole animal. What about fat soluble vitamins in low fat diet?
That is, well, the actual quantity of fat-soluble vitamins that we need is pretty low, and those can be really heavily concentrated in animal products like liver. So for example, if you eat a little bit of liver a few times a week, your vitamin A intake is going to be completely covered, and that's without raising the fat intake of your diet to levels that would ruin the therapeutic benefit. Same with, shellfish again. Like if you eat some oysters and some liver, you really don't need, on a micronutrient basis, a lot of other animal products. Those will cover your bases stupendously, far more than eating a steak will.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to try to eat some organ meats at some point. But but still, this doesn't work for vegans or vegetarians. They can't get that. So what are they supposed to do?
Stop being vegetarian.
Yes. Thank you. All right. So have you looked at your blood work?
Not lately. I should.
Okay. Well, I haven't either, so I just know that I'm doing great. So, no. Okay. Here's a little bit of a controversial topic because vegetables are usually the one thing that both sides can agree on. But more and more, I'm hearing these crazy people talking about some, cruciferous vegetables that they have phytates, and vegetables don't want you to eat them, and low sugar fruits only. This stuff kind of makes sense a little, if you think about it. I'm going to let you answer, but the fruit, it's supposedly what the plant wants us to eat, and we could throw the seed somewhere and it's sweeter and it's indication that we could eat it, all that kind of thing. And that plants, their only defense mechanism is to create these maybe anti-nutrients or toxins. Yes. So what's going on there? Is that a thing or not?
It's a thing in some senses, but not in the way it's typically exaggerated to be, I'll say. For example, you have things like wheat that have certain lectins that will cause issues for people with celiac disease. There's lectins in raw beans that can definitely kill you if you eat them. So there's some truth to the anti-nutrient toxicity argument, but in terms of goitrogenic vegetables, for example, we talk about kale and cruciferous veggies causing problems with the thyroid. That's actually never really been shown by science. It's more of like a weird logic tumble that has been done by some people and got kind of caught up in as a truism in some ways. But I mean, the fact is that vegetable intake has been a huge part of our development evolutionarily, going back to before we split with chimps and stuff. If you look at the intake of vegetables among any living creature in the wild, including primates, they have a huge intake of phytates and of quote unquote anti-nutrients. And the irony is that a lot of those are actually anti-cancer within the human body, and they have certain benefits. Like the body benefits from being challenged in certain ways with things that trigger immune responses. It's actually part of our homeostasis. So it doesn't really make sense to me to say vegetables are dangerous. Or even with fruit, there's a myth that I wrote about this in my blog too, that all wild fruit is really small, bitter, fibrous. It's not tasty. It's not like these huge ripe things we see in the store. That might be true in certain climates, but if we look at the tropics, kind of the seat of where humans initially came from, Oh, actually, I guess that's being questioned now, so maybe I take that back. But, we've spent time in the tropics. Much of our bodies are still adapted to tropical temperatures. We keep the thermostat inside at 72 degrees for a reason. In those areas, there's actually a lot of wild fruit that is gigantic, incredibly sweet, high in sugar, grows that way without human intervention, and probably what contributed to early human diets in some capacity. So I wouldn't even say that that it's necessarily true that small fruit is more natural.
What about the fructose content? So you don't think that humans can just constantly year round eat high sugar fruits?
I would say seasonally is probably a good way to do it. Same with fat intake. I think fat intake should fluctuate seasonally, ideally.
We'll talk about that for a second.
Yeah.
I love this theory about that there's two metabolic states and that it was sort of natural to cycle them.
Right. So I think as we're talking about this whole spectrum thing and the low fat and the high fat, clearly the body is able to handle both of those states. A metabolically healthy body will be able to handle those states. It will be able to move from one to the other without much trouble. And if we look at human history, one of the most ancient features of our diet has been inconsistency. There's been at no point in human history where the year-round diet has been homogeneous. It always fluctuates with what's locally available, fluctuates seasonally. There's going to be certain periods of the year where animals that we hunt are going to be much higher in fat intake, and there's going to be periods of the year where they are very, very lean. So there's going to be a natural kind of wave going on where our macronutrients will fluctuate in the context of the season. During sunnier months, we might be more active, we might be outside more, we might be consuming more fruit sugar because of what's in season. There's a lot of parts that click together. And so one thing I've landed on is that macronutrient cycling might be kind of a solution for these two extremes, especially for people who don't want to be on one end forever and who feel really scared about never being able to eat a big ripe peach again, or who feel really scared about not being able to eat a ribeye steak ever again. There's ways, I think, to design a diet that is cycling through these states in a way that benefits us.
Yeah.
That makes sense evolutionarily too.
Yeah. So I guess to recap, it makes sense evolutionarily because there's times when we were high fat, low carb, and there's probably times when we were low carb, high fat, and maybe it was the winter and then the summer, but we weren't doing them simultaneously. And so you think that it could be a good way to do it is cycle them, but how quickly can you cycle them though? I kind of asked you about this earlier when we talked on the phone, but we're talking about 6 months at a time almost, but can you do that days at a time?
I think so. And I'll say that because I have talked to people who, after reading my low-fat blog post, started experimenting with that and who are like, oh my God, this is amazing. They'll be ketogenic for a few days and then they'll be on a really low-fat diet for a few days, and having all of those states covered, as well as having a larger just pool of foods you can choose from in the context of your entire diet, seems to be beneficial for some people. And I know that carb cycling is kind of catching on within certain athletic communities. You can carb up on days where you're exercising, do low carb on days where you're more sedentary. There's ways to kind of design that around your lifestyle too. So I think either of those options can probably work. I think eating seasonally can work. I think there's probably ways to kind of hack your metabolism by fluctuating between the states in a more rapid way. I don't have any hard data showing what is optimal among that, but I think anyone who's interested in experimenting with that should probably do so and see how it works for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm still doing fine with my diet. And
do you, man. Do you.
Yeah. Bring up a point that on the days where you're more active, I just played 2 hours of basketball straight, nonstop sprinting, and haven't eaten carbs in a week. So I don't, there's many examples of this, of people not needing carbs. So I guess I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah.
People can win marathons without carbs.
Yeah. I think it's more that if you are going to introduce carbs into your diet, the best days to do that are the days where you're very active, because you're going to be able to use them more efficiently.
I like that statement.
Yeah.
So why is fiber supposed to be good for us?
Much of it has to do with the effect on our gut microbiomes. So we have certain bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids within the gut. And those short-chain fatty acids have so many benefits in terms of cancer protection, in terms of helping signaling within our bodies. And if we deprive our microbiome of the food that it needs to support its own populations of butyrate, one example is a short-chain fatty acid. If we start starving those bacteria by not feeding them well enough, the long-term effects of that are very likely to be harmful for the human body. And so fiber itself, it has some benefits in terms of like reducing blood sugar response to meals, but I think the larger benefit is exclusive to the bacteria that we harbor because they need that for food. So it's like feeding your fish pond every day. You know, you want to keep your koi happy, right?
But you don't, but so people do fine on, say, Sean Baker with only meat. So you don't necessarily need it. So you're saying maybe the gut biome is off. Do you need like tons of fiber all the time, or is it you just need some resistant starch or some little bits of fiber to feed your gut?
Every study I've seen on this suggests that the more you're consuming, the better. And I mean, of course, there's going to be specific examples of people who are eating zero fiber diets and their health is better. And there's probably instances too where people eating, like maybe a zero carb diet are going to do better compared to where they were before because they were having some type of overgrowth that they've now starved. But it's a little bit like chemotherapy where you're killing healthy cells along with the bad ones, kind of. And if you're killing off the bad bacteria along with some of the good ones, you might see new health problems over the course of many years start emerging that weren't there initially.
Okay. Oh, also, I want to squeeze this in earlier, but I love vegetables. I'm a meat and vegetables guy. I'll eat meat and vegetables all day. So I'm not trying to say that they're bad.
Duly noted.
Yeah. But do you think low sugar fruits are better? Like cucumbers, bell peppers, avocados, tomatoes, that type of stuff?
It really depends. I mean, I'm not anti high sugar fruit, but if your goal is nutrition density, lower sugar fruits are going to have a lower caloric value. You can eat more of them for the same total energy intake than you can with like eating a bunch of papaya or mangoes or whatever. So it kind of depends on what your goals are. It depends on how your body responds. I've gone through phases of eating just ridiculous quantities of fruit. I've gone through phases of eating much less. I do think seasonally it fluctuates too, just how well you respond to that. But I mean, fruit isn't bad. It's not. I've seen very harsh words flung at fruit that I disagree with. So. Well,
I think it can be bad if you're also eating a high-fat diet and you also have a metabolic condition.
I could agree with that. And if you're already eating a hypercaloric diet, if you're eating too much energy for your body, anything you add on top of that is going to be harmful, even if the item itself is not actually bad, because you're pushing yourself to excess.
That's kind of a point, is that there's no real bad macronutrient. It's
exactly. Yeah.
There's no bad whole food. It's just how you're eating it and the context. So I'm glad you brought up nutrient density. So we're almost done here, but there's nutrient density and satiety. So I like this sort of low carb diet because I only eat twice a day. I'm really full. Everything is pretty nutrient dense. And I kind of would pick apart your diet a little bit, is why do you want to eat so much? Or how are you hungry all the time, or that kind of thing?
Well, when we look at satiety, we actually need to focus more on protein content. In every study that's done, for the most part, protein is the most satiating macronutrient. Lower carbohydrate diets tend to also be higher in protein, unless they're like really specific, low protein ketogenic, just because as you're eating more meat products, you're eating a lot more protein too. And so I imagine my diet might be equivalent to yours in terms of protein intake, just because I eat a lot of lean animal products. It's a big part of my diet. So in terms of like the satiation factor, it's 3:36 right now. Like, I haven't eaten today. I'm not hungry.
Oh wow!
Right now, yeah. It's I didn't intend. I just woke up late. So, but it's I don't feel like I'm a slave to a certain eating schedule at all. I can go really long periods of time without needing food. I can eat a lot in one sitting if I need to. Put me at a sushi buffet, and I will I will put them out of business. But yeah, I mean, it's like you adapt over time. I think your body gets used to. It gets used to whatever you throw at it over time. So I wouldn't say my diet is something that requires constant food consumption at all.
So maybe more of the problem is people who are sugar addicted and snacking on high sugar stuff, and or people just eating protein leverage hypothesis thing, where if you're eating snacks or meals without enough protein, that's when you're going to get hungry.
Yeah, I think either of those are probably pretty likely. And two, yeah, like the whole food reward thing too. If you're eating combinations of food that are highly palatable, you're not going to be relying on your body's actual innate hunger instincts. You're going to be kind of focusing more on that reward pathway, like, oh, I feel like I need a little pick me up right now. I feel like I need a brain boost. I feel like I need to be happy. So I'm going to put something in my mouth to achieve that effect. So what's the benefit of both really low fat diets and really high fat diets is that by separating the macronutrients, you're automatically reducing food reward, because that's one of the most palatable things anyone can do is combine fat with carbohydrates or sugar, especially. It's like those are like the two magic things that you find in every dessert that's going to make it tasty and going to make you want to eat it. So when you remove that from the equation, then you're removing a big kind of unhealthy incentive for eating, and you can kind of rely more on your body's signals.
I think that's huge, and that not a lot of people are talking about.
Well, that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah, no, I have definitely got into that lately, and it makes a lot of sense. I like these things that unite both sides, where this is a common theme. This is how it works.
Yeah.
So I guess that leads us to the solution. What do we do about all this now that we know this? Because part of the problem is it's so complicated. So we talked about totally different dietary patterns that both can achieve a good result. But how do you make it easy for people to follow? And how, it just seems they're so different. So it's like, oh, choose this or this, and they're totally different.
Right. I think the way we need to break it down into baby steps. And the first thing I look at is kind of this Venn diagram, holistic perspective of what are the common denominators in everything that's working. And I think you and I can agree that moving towards more whole foods is imperative. That means ditching junk, no matter whether it's low carb or high carb or intermediate, whatever. We need to really emphasize to the public that we need to not only be thinking about macronutrients, because I think, and this is what I came to after writing my book, was the worst thing that the food pyramid did to the public was tell people to look at foods in terms of macronutrients. Like the focus away from food itself as a like holistic entity and towards just a collection of nutrients and carbohydrate and fat and protein. I think that really killed our relationship with food. And I think it ruined our food culture if we had one to begin with. So what I want to do with people is move back towards a more holistic view of food itself. Like, does this look like something that you could pick out of the ground or like off of a tree or that you could stab with a spear? I think that's kind of the paleo mindset of, go back to nature in that sense. But then from there also really question the things like vegetable oils. Like, why would vegetable oils be so necessary for humans when they weren't even present in our diet for 99.9999999% of our existence? So, get people questioning those kinds of things. And then from there, it's more of a matter of tailoring the dietary choices to the person's goals, to their health context, to their, like if somebody has diabetes, they're going to need to be a lot more strict with whatever they're doing than somebody who's 25 and just wants to feel good and boost their basketball performance or whatever. So it's really hard to assign a homogenous set of guidelines. But I think the starting place is really to move people back towards whole foods in general. That alone will generally help people quite tremendously. And again, with the food reward thing, that's kind of a first step too, is teaching people how their brains are being tricked by food combinations that the food industry has freaking dopamine labs that are testing different combinations to right. It's like it's their job to make us addicted to things. And I think being aware of that is really important too, because most people don't understand what spell they're under with the things that they do, food or otherwise. So I think bringing awareness is imperative too. And my whole thing is I feel really uncomfortable telling people what to do. That's never been my favorite job. I will tell people this is what I would do in your shoes, or I will tell people this is the information I know. Do with it what you want. And so I think trying to shift more responsibility onto the consumer by saying, you can't always trust the government guidelines. You can't trust these things that you're hearing from from different parts of different dietary communities. Like you have to have an element of personal responsibility and you have to do some critical thinking. So I think the other element too is teaching people how to think about nutrition, which goes back to that quote you read of mine that made me sound smart. Thank you for that. That was wonderful. So it's like, full circle. This isn't my specialty. I find information, but I don't necessarily have applications for it. So that's where you step in.
Well, exactly. Ryan. That's what I was going to say. It's all about information. That's why I'm making this film. Yep. And that's why I'm going to come up to Seattle and interview you tomorrow. How cool is that?
Stoked.
Yeah. So
yeah, he'll be fun.
This is so cool. And yes, I am trying to think about how to present this information clearly. Well, that is exactly my whole job. That's all I think about is how to present this information clearly. And yeah, I'm working on diagrams or visuals and something to easily tell someone how to eat and make it as easy as looking at something, which is impossible. I mean, that's what the whole food pyramid disaster kind of is about.
Right.
They try to make it simple and you can't just make it super simple with one diagram. But I'm working on something and we'll see how it pans out. But I'm using all this information and I've learned so much from you and you've given me a different perspective and I feel like I'm more open-minded and I'm connecting a lot of dots. And this is...
wonderful. My job here is
yes. So everyone...
Thank you.
Listen to Denise, even though she's going to not tell you what to do.
That's right.
She'll give you slight suggestions and urge you in the right way.
Gentle motions in one direction.
All right. Well, I think this should all be really enlightening for people, and I hope it has done some good for their lives and their diet.
Me too.
Let's end on that note.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. It's been awesome. All right, there it is. A lot of stuff to think about here. Pretty interesting, and I'm glad I talked to her early on because it really did help open my eyes to some other sides. So tell me what you think. Reach out on Twitter. We're at foodlies.org or on Instagram at food.lies, and let's talk. And please rate and review this show on iTunes and tell your friends and support us on Indiegogo. We really need your help to finish off this funding and we're extending it 30 more days. If you haven't already yet, please head on over and check it out, indiegogo.com, and search for Food Lies. Thank you and see you next time.